novelty are casted always in every page and together with a traditional way of thinking. For instance, the secularization of natural law, which is considered to be very important, and most people consider it to be the work of Grotius. And that is, the idea that natural law is not derived from God as a lawgiver, is at least as old as Gregory of Rimini, who died in 1358. Let me write it down. Now, this is a very important thinker. He died in 1358 in Paris, not in Rimini. I don't know when he was born, but nobody knows. So, and actually, so this is the idea. He was the very first person to advance the idea that natural law was going to be natural law even if God did not back it. He was not ready to say even if God did not exist, of course. I mean, he didn't want to be burned. I mean, he just wanted to stay alive. But actually what he meant was that natural law does not depend at all on the will of God. It's not God that makes natural law. God had a good plan for mankind. And then mankind can find natural law which is definitely in accordance, usually, with God's will, but does not depend directly on God's will. So, if we think of Grotius as the person who in 1625 secularized the notion of natural law, we would be wrong, because it goes back to the scholastics. So that's one instance, and it could probably be traced back also to some passages of Thomas Aquinas, as I said yesterday. And it was long attributed to Grotius, who wrote Grotius. Let's forget his real name. I mean, this is a Latin name. Grotius will be happy with that. Grotius. And he wrote his major book in 1625. And that's important because in 1625 historians think that modern natural rights theory began with this book, which is called De Jure Belli Pacis, on peace and war, although law of peace and war. So this came out in 1625, and usually, when you ask somebody when modern political doctrines on natural law began, they will say 1625, the Jure Belli Pacis. So you got to know that. And actually, he's considered to be responsible also for the secularization, because he said, at a certain point, he said, and this, he's talking about natural rights, and he says, and this would be true even if we would say a thing which we cannot say without blasphemy and so on. But at the end, he says, even if God did not exist. I mean, and so that's considered to be like the secularization of natural law that most people used to think was the thing that was completely different. But as we said, it goes back even to the scholastics. And but going back to the problem of continuity, actually, scholars that tend to stress the continuity do have a very clear textual evidence of the close connections between the modern and medieval thinkers and even the ancient ones. And moreover, neither as a method nor as a body of doctrine was scholasticism a spent force by the year 1600 and even in 1650 or so on. And actually, the greatest synthesis of scholastic moral theory came out in 1612. And of course, you want to know the real title in Latin. And the author is a very important one. And the title is And the year is 1612. So like the greatest synthesis of scholasticism came actually out during modern times. And so it's de legibus ac deo legislatori. No need to translate that, right? It's mean on laws, considering that God is the legislator, roughly, very roughly. I could come up with better translations, but and so he was a Jesuit, and his first name is Francisco, by the way. And so actually we should ask ourselves, what is it that makes modern doctrine so modern? What is there something that makes it very modern? And my answer would be that the thing that makes natural right theories so novel is not so much what we find in them, but is pretty much what we find outside of them. That is, the changing political atmosphere in Europe. And what I'm referring to, the rise of what we call the modern state, and according to a lot of historians, should just be called the state, as there was no ancient or archaic state or anything like that, but there was only the state was only a modern thing. And so in this sense, the new institutional reality of modern times that accompanied all these theories after the 1600s and that was shaped, during the 14 and 1500s, it's the greatest concentration of political power ever known to mankind. So at this point, the natural law theorists had to face something very new. Absolutism. The state. And modern natural right thinkers are modern first and foremost because they are confronted with the state, the institutional framework of modernity. So that, to me, is like the most important thing for which they're modern. And of course, sometimes they're confused by they merge together with the social contract theorists. And so you have a lot of people, the social contract, very simply it works like there was a state of nature. For some reasons it didn't work, or it was not enough, or it was bad enough, as if for Hobbes. And then people had a contract and they formed political societies, that is the state, and they transferred, or maybe they did not, some of their natural rights to the sovereign. And then you have political community. Now that's contractarianism. And for a certain period, especially in the 1600s, the idea of the contract was very much and closely linked to the idea of natural rights. But actually, from the intellectual and theoretical point of view, you can make clear distinctions between the two. One thing is to say how political societies were born, and to postulate it even as an historical reality or just a theoretical concept. And the other one is to say that men and women have natural rights, that is based on nature. One of the confusions actually is that most of the people think about natural rights as the rights that people possess in a state of nature. That is a very narrow way of looking at natural rights. Natural rights, according to the long tradition, is pretty much the rights that are dictated by nature, that are prescribed by nature to man, and that pertain directly to the essence of man. So, actually, while the characteristic of ancient and medieval natural law was to be immutable, as we've said yesterday, the main feature of modern natural law was to produce rights, individual rights that were thought to be inalienable. And that's a good concept, and we'll come back to this again pretty soon. And you have to know that in John Locke's terminology, at least in the second treatise, there's no mention of inalienability of rights. And although he uses the concept, and that has given rise to a lot of talk and discussion about inalienable and natural rights. But we'll discuss that in a bit. In turn, actually, inalienability means that one cannot divest himself or posterity of these rights. and that the state or political power cannot infringe upon the same rights. The concept has two meanings. And so the nature-given rights are the essence of human dignity, of the possibility actually of pursuing a fruitful and meaningful life. And to violate them is to deny the humanity of the individual. So it's just not doing wrong to someone. But for these writers, for most of these writers, and most of these thinkers, it really means to violate the dignity of the individual. So, but we'll go to this crucial point later. First of all, we have to sketch an outline of how the classical liberal tradition came to form on life, liberty, and property, to focus, on life, liberty, and property as the powerful trio summing up all natural rights. As you know, for the classical liberal tradition, there are only three natural rights: life, liberty, and property. And when you think about it, we could say life and property. The idea that nobody can aggress yourself, and the idea that nobody can aggress upon your lawful possessions. Because life is liberty, that's part of these. You can define liberty certainly in terms of being free to acquire goods and being free from aggression. So the close connection between liberty and property is part of the natural law tradition, from Thomas to Suarez, and was later developed fully by John Locke, as you all know. But the scholastics already called property dominium of external things, and liberty dominium of oneself. So there you have a very close link. It was dominium over external things, that was property, and dominium over yourself, that was freedom. So you have a clear link that you don't have to wait until John Locke to see the close link. And Suarez actually used the same word dominium to define the sovereign authority. So he used the word dominium in three senses. It could be liberty. So when he was doing something wrong with his dominium, then you certainly had the right to rebel and not to obey him. Now, the real problem is to distinguish between contractarianism, as I said, and nature-based rights. In other words, some rights might be viewed as the outcome of a contractual agreement and thus based on consent, and other rights as dictated by the very nature of man. And this is the way that most people look at natural rights, but I'll say how this could be kind of murky. And in many early modern theories, the line between consent and nature is not so easy to detect. On one side you have a lot of people just thought that property came out of consent, and then it was John Locke who proved that it came out of nature, and it was a natural right. For instance, in Suarez's view, in situations of extreme hardship, the needy have the right to make use of private property of others, but not because of certain characteristics of private property, but simply because life overrides property. He believed that there were natural rights, both life and property, but if you're risking your life, you could get whatever you wanted, and you were in need. And that sort, in a certain sense, it could make some sense. But because private property returns, in his idea, it returns in times of hardship. It returns to the original common in the state of emergency. So the idea of the original common ownership for all mankind is present almost in anybody. In the 1600s, that was that God gave the earth in common to the children of man. That's also written on the Bible. So it doesn't say in common; it says gave the earth to the children of man. But that's the way they read it. And actually, the only reason that private ownership was ever permitted is that it was consented to by the common owners. And that up until John Locke, that was pretty much the view of very many thinkers. So contractual agreements are always overridden by the goals set by the law of nature, which is in turn, roughly and broadly speaking, the common good in Suarez's view. So in a certain sense, private property is contractual, consented. Even tacitly consented by the people who let you take something out of the commons. So the idea was later expanded by the most important Protestant thinker of the times, Grotius again, who wrote The Law of War and Peace, as I said, in 1625, which was very influential. What you do not find in The Law of War and Peace was the idea of the state of nature. The state of nature is not there. It developed a bit later, but you have the idea that there are natural rights. And Grotius outlines his view of how private property came into existence in Book 2, Chapter 2. And let me quote this. Yes. God conferred upon the human race a general right over things of a lower nature. Each man could at once take whatever he wished for his own needs. But whatever each had thus taken from his own needs, another could not take from him. End quote. And then he states how things became subject to private ownership. It happened, and this is a quotation again, by a kind of agreement, either expressed as by division or implied as by occupation. So that was his idea of private property. And with some important differences, actually the same theory on the origin of property was becoming part of the modern natural rights doctrine in the 1600s. It was Samuel Pufendorf. Better write it down. So it is Samuel Pufendorf who wrote The Law of Nature and Nations I forgot the year, but it was 1660 something. You know? Circa. Yeah, circa. Mid 16. All right. Anyway. It was The Law of Nature and Nations. It's a very common title. You find a whole bunch of books that are called The Law of Nature and Nations. Because the Law of Nations in the 1600s was the law of nature. It was the same thing. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson's one time he was translating, and he translated the law, Jus Gentium, and he translated, which was actually the Law of Nations, and he translated natural rights, natural law, because it was supposed to be the same thing. You know, in the Law of Nations, there was nothing like positive law. There was only natural law. You want me to write it down? The law. And you had Fattel and all sort of people who wrote books with the same title and pretty profound stuff that I have to spend much time on. Anyway, he based the right to property on human agreement, although the human agreement was of a different kind, but it was a human agreement rather than natural law. And at this point, you know, like the question of property and its origin seems to be pretty much solved by these thinkers, and they were authorities. You know, they were well known throughout Europe, and everybody referred to Grotius and Pufendorf, and everybody was pretty much settled. But what happened that then there's John Locke came along, and he changed the whole idea as far as the origin of property goes. And so in 1690, he published, well, you know what he published, right? The 2 treatises on government. I don't have to write it down. It was in 1690, I mean, he put the date 1689 on it. He actually published it in 1690. But now we know that he wrote the book in between 1679 and 1683. So like almost 10 years earlier than a lot of people thought for very many years. Now, what does that mean? Well, the first thing it means that John Locke was not writing any justification for the Glorious Revolution, because he wrote it prior to the Glorious Revolution. So, the second thing is it was anonymous. I mean, he just wrote in his will that he probably was the author. Everybody knew, but it was anonymous. So he was really afraid. And if you're writing the justification of a regime which is in place, I mean, you're not afraid of anything, right? I mean, you just want to be a sort of laureate philosopher. But he was actually afraid. He was afraid because of what happened to Sidney in 1683. He actually lost his head for republicanism, literally, of course. And so actually it was written probably in 1679-81, and I point out this to you because it's very important, because you have to understand that it's much more a revolutionary theory than we always thought, especially that Marx and a lot of other people thought. And so it changed forever the debate on the origins of property, that is, private property. And this book, the two treatises of government, I mean, you always talk about the first and the second one, but it's actually the same book. You know, it's like two parts of the same book. And but we all do. We talk about the first and second one. And it's really considered the starting point of classical liberalism and also libertarianism. And Locke's doctrines, of course, did not come out of the blue. In fact, Lord Acton himself considered him to be the last of the scholastics, and he said that Thomas Aquinas was the first of the Whigs. So, in this sense, you can see that there's a relationship with the old tradition. And it's very clear, because especially now we know how much Locke's ideas were deeply rooted in the natural law tradition, as it is clearly shown by his essays on the law of nature, which were written probably in 1663-64, but were published only in 1953 for the first time. They came out and were published in 1953. So a lot of people said, well, this guy, because a lot of people thought that he didn't talk long enough about what law of nature was, what he meant by the law of nature. And actually he didn't do that because he had already done this in the essays on the law of nature, but were never published. So you can see that there is a clear connection between scholasticism and everything that was going on and the thought of John Locke. So Locke is really a political thinker of great force, and his arguments that tie private property and private ownership to natural rights and natural justice are still at the core of classical liberal and libertarian thinking. And moreover, actually, since we are in America, you know that the founding fathers, most of them at least, were thinking in Lockean terms, as they thought that the only legitimate role of government was to protect individual rights that predated any establishment of political society. That was the common understanding in America. Actually, John Locke was much more important for political developments in America than in England. In England, he was not, politically, he was taken too seriously as a philosopher and not too seriously as a political thinker. But in America, it was quite the opposite, and I think he was a much greater political thinker than a philosopher. He was a great philosopher, but much greater political thinker. And in spite of the revisionism that came from the so-called Republican school that you've heard about, Gardenwood, Pocock, and so on, the U.S. at the founding was really found in Locke the basis of their moral philosophy. And really, note that for me the U.S. is always plural. I'll never say the U.S. is, as they did prior to the War of Yankee Aggression. Thank you. And so anyway, John Locke was the first to demonstrate and to show brilliantly that the laws of nature impose an obligation on men to respect the property rights of anybody who acquired these rights in a just and legitimate way. So Locke really wants to show how men might come to have a property in several parts of that which God gave to mankind in common, and that without any express compact among all the commoners. This was a quotation, end quote. Man might come to have a property in several parts. That was actually his task. So the legitimacy of the original acquisition was really the task, and to demonstrate that was the task that Locke was really wanted to achieve, and he did achieve it. And Locke actually discovered that private property was indeed imposed by the law of nature long before any human convention sanctioned it. And he begins to explore in the second treatise the characteristics of the state of nature. And I wanted to quote at length the second treatise, but I will not do that right now, otherwise I will not have time to conclude my argument. But it's very short, brief. You can read it in one afternoon, and it stays with you for quite a while. And so Locke agrees with the traditional view that originally God gave the world in common to the children of men. However, quote, every man has a property in his own person, and this nobody has any right to but himself. So this was really the starting point of the idea that you can acquire property from in the state of nature in a legitimate way, because you do own yourself, and nobody else has a claim on that but yourself. So this is really a crucial point. In fact, it is exactly from this absolute right of self-ownership that the legitimate acquisition of what was once common property becomes possible. In fact, it was in obedience to a command of God and reason that man mixed his own labor with the earth to improve it for the benefit of life. So it was really a command of God and a command of reason, pretty much the same thing. And man annexed to the land that nobody was using his labor, which is something that was his property and nobody else had a title to, nor could without injury take from him. And so Locke clearly stated two axioms that are crucial to the contemporary libertarian movement: the self-ownership and the homesteading axioms. Homesteading. So private property was now founded on the solid rock of natural law instead of the murky sands of human conventions. And I'm not saying that it's not been challenged, but actually if you take a look at any article written in the 1900s on private property, they always begin quoting Locke. I mean, even if it's to refute his position and so on. I mean, whenever they start talking about private property, they always begin with John Locke, because it was very forceful, and certainly it sounds something like of natural justice too. There are other aspects of John Locke's political doctrine that are very important, definitely, but nothing compares to this. Labor and reason establish the title to private property, and there is no consent, either express or tacit, involved in this operation. And actually, in the 1800s, you had a bunch of British socialists that, given this labor theory of acquiring property, tried to use John Locke as sort of the grandfather of socialism. It didn't last very long. I mean, it was clearly flawed, but certainly the idea that he put labor as the essence or essential entity, an essential thing that came out to justify property was important also to some socialists. But in some part of the second treatise, Locke refers to property meaning life, liberty, and estate. Usually property is private ownership and so on. But then he refers to that property summing up all the natural rights, that is, life, liberty, and estate. That is, property becomes the sum of all natural rights. And it is in this way he began a tradition which we can call the property rights tradition. And actually the dream, I would say, or illusion at least, of Locke, Jefferson, and countless classical liberals after them, was to create a government as a rights protector. That was their dream that we can now see as an illusion, and strictly confined to its role of offering the individual pretty much the same protection for his rights that she would seek for herself if she were so powerful. That was the idea, actually, that most of these classical liberals had. It was a very noble idea. I greatly respect it. But, to tell you the truth, I agree with Rothbard that says that the real utopia is limited government, because government power tends to grow in itself, and there's no way of stopping it. So the real utopia seems to be limited government. And, well, anarchy might be a sort of utopia too, but it's never been tried, while limited government has been tried and it failed. So one thing must be clear: in the Lockean and largely American framework, individuals do not give up any of their natural rights whenever they enter into society. There is this bizarre notion, and sometimes you even read this in textbooks, that they give up some of their rights. No, they do not give up any of their natural rights. One thing they probably do give up is self-defense. Because actually the state of nature, according to Locke, is a state in which there is no common judge. And if you do have a common judge, then you give up your right to self-defense. But that's probably the only thing you may think of giving up when you enter society. Rather, individuals enter into a state of political society and leave the state of nature only to better preserve and protect their natural rights, in his theory. And it could be argued that the only right they do relinquish, as I said, is self-defense. But the compact that creates political society, in Locke's opinion, has got to be unanimous. You see, if one person says, no, I'm pretty much glad to remain in the state of nature with all my rights, that's all for the rest of the community. There's no way you can create. So there's anything like this murky concept of quasi-unanimity that Buchanan uses or anything like that. It's unanimity. It's got to be, everybody's got to consent. And so to enter in a social state, you have to go by a contract of this kind. And the social state means to have a common judge, because you just believe that the real problem with the state of nature was that you didn't have a common judge to refer to. And so the principle was nemo iudic. I'll write it down. So the principle that was violated in the state of nature was that nobody should judge nobody should judge his own things, his own quarrels, his own conflicts. So that was violated, and then so people moved to the state of society in order to avoid this problem. But you have to understand that not only you have a common judge, but what you do is you create, it's really twofold, the contract that creates political society. First, it creates a global civil right, that is the right to securely enjoy life, liberty, and property. And it does not create any conventional rights, like the rights you can have by majorities with parliament or anything like that. It just creates you a global civil right. It gives you a global civil right, the right to be protected by government in enjoying life, liberty, and property. There's nothing like such a right to a welfare check or anything like that could be created by a majority. And conventionally, actually, what it happens, you can say that these rights are reinforced conventionally, but only the natural rights are reinforced conventionally, and there's no new right implied in the contract. So in this framework, civil rights are the rights of being protected by the government. On the other hand, the compact poses strict limitations on government activities. Not only the violations, but also the scarce protection of natural rights render the government illegitimate and thus subject to the right of revolution. So we have two rights stemming out of the compact: a right to be protected by the government and an individual right to revolution, that is, to protection from the government. So you have, with John Locke, you have this very limited government, you have the right to be protected, and of course you have your own right, which is the right to revolution in John Locke is always individual. It's clearly stated. And I don't know where, I'll show it to you, but it's clearly stated it's individual. It could be that you could do it collectively, but it's not of the whole community. It's always an individual right. So this sums up, actually, the moral and political philosophy of Locke and also of most of the founding fathers of the United States. And, as you know, they were very suspicious of political power in general, and also they thought that the real threat for human liberty came from government. And in this sense, they not only considered rights natural, but also inalienable, as I said. Now, one problem with this is that Locke doesn't use the concept. He uses the concept, but he does not use the word. I will go very quickly on that. But the concept of inalienable rights was certainly very important to revolutionary America. So if certain basic rights were to be the moral touchstone by means of which the conduct of all political authority must be checked, then they must be inherent to whole individuals. This was clear for the revolutionary generation in America, but actually what happens to be yesterday's matter of course, becomes today's puzzle. As you see, with all these historians writing pages and pages on inalienable rights, and they don't know what they're talking about. And so many contemporary scholars have trouble understanding the very concept of inalienable rights. And some even contend that inalienable and natural are two separate categories, which is really bull as far as I'm concerned. And actually, there's a scholar who said that I could relinquish my natural right to property by letting kids play in my own yard. That's a very bizarre statement, and it comes from a good scholar, I tell you that. I mean, you're exactly using your natural rights to property. You let people in and play, That's a way of using it, not forfeiting your natural right. But I'll make it very simple for you. Inalienable actually means that one cannot divest herself of these rights, even if you really wanted to. And being the essence of the human condition, it would be equivalent to saying, I am not a person. However, inalienability is the impression of nature. So nature renders inalienable certain rights by imprinting her mark on them. And by creating man, nature's God has also provided them with rights both natural and inalienable. They are one and inseparable. Now, one last word on the recent revival of natural rights doctrine. As you know, after the 1800s, it went down, slowly declined. At the end of the 1800s, it was over, and it was only the Catholic Church who used it. In 1879, they proclaimed St. Thomas Aquinas to be like the official philosopher of the Church, and so on. For almost 100 years, if you wanted to talk about natural rights, you had to know your Latin and go to talk to a lot of bishops. But what happened in 1974? A book came out, not a great book at all, but influential, which is called Anarchy, State, and Utopia, and it was written by Robert Nozick. But the good thing about this book is that since the guy was at Harvard, then you could start talking about natural rights again, and they would accept the articles, at least for quite a while. But everybody says, that he takes a natural rights approach. However, he never really argues for his thesis that individuals are ends in themselves and thus have rights to life, liberty, and property. He just states it in the first pages, and that's it. Then he never argues about it. He never argues in favor of it. As his position was never defended, it was very easy for him to abandon his weak classical liberalism and become a socialist. And he did that. I mean, it's written all over. He said it to me once, actually. I was talking to Robert Nozick, and I was, he was considered at the time a great philosopher, and he said, "Oh, there's only a bunch of you libertarians. Why don't you go on an island and build up a society?" I said, that's a great way of reasoning for one of the greatest philosophers of our times. I said, really great argument. But anyway, since he wanted to be considered part of the Harvard establishment, I understand that there was some utility. But actually, the books that he wrote after Anarchy, State, and Utopia, nobody really cared about it. Not at Harvard and not anywhere else. The Nature of Rationality is a book that made me laugh all through the book. I mean, it's just not his field. But a much more serious effort, and that's really the end of it, a much more serious effort to restate the natural rights doctrine was done by our Murray Rothbard. In 1982, in The Ethics of Liberty, a book that I was very proud to translate in Italian a few years ago. Now, so you're pretty much sure that I read it, since I translated it. So Rothbard really takes the position of natural rights to the extreme. He actually uses the concept of inalienability to destroy the idea of the legitimacy of the social compact. So the social compact would in fact imply the alienation of natural rights, and thus it is illegitimate, just like a contract by which someone would sell himself to slavery. So at this point you can see that the two traditions that Locke fused, on one side contractarianism and natural rights on the other, are now completely separated. The most notable defender of the former, of contractarianism, is John Rawls, who wrote a lot of books, but the most influential of which was A Theory of Justice in 1971, who actually argues that we can agree upon certain ideas of what a just and fair society is, but that we have no natural rights to begin with. He actually argues that we do not own our own talents. I mean, let's say I was Pavarotti, I was a great singer. I do not own this kind of talent. And I guess what kind of personality comes out of this when you don't even own your talents and you owe it to society? I think you're not even human. So while the natural rights doctrine is still the greatest fence to liberty, as Rothbard shows, the contractarian tradition has followed a quite different path. The justification of the warfare welfare state that historically has been the greatest threat to individual liberty. Thank you.